Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Fourth Wall, the only comic book related show that brings you the answers to such burning questions as why does he pick Robin so young? Is it pronounced Raish or Ra's al Ghul? And where does he get those wonderful toys? We are your hosts.
I'm John.
And I'm Joe, also known as Mr. H on www.graphicpolicy.com. You can follow me there for my weekly exploits. And today is a pretty special day. We're actually on the eve of a very special day, John. Would you like to explain what that is?
An auspicious occasion, National Batman Day.
Absolutely.
And as such, we're going to focus our inaugural episode around Batman. We're going to discuss the history of Batman, what some of our favorite runs are,
Yep.
and what Batman means to us as a character.
Absolutely. A lot of ground to cover. And like I was saying to you before the show, for us comic book fans, National Batman Day is like Christmas, Hanukkah, and Kwanzaa all rolled into one. I mean, it does not get any better. We are both wearing Batman shirts today because, let's face it, we left our tights in the cave and no one wants to be Robin. So, yeah, I think the best way to start is people who even are newbies to this. Everyone knows of Batman, but maybe people don't know the complete history or even some of the deeper history of Batman. So I figured we could start with that and go into a little bit of how Batman came to be. And I defer to you because you were a little bit more my senior scholar on that. So,
Well, Batman's almost a mythological figure at this point. It's been around since 1939. Originally, DC Comics was called National Publications. And back in 1939, after the success of Superman, National Publications editors approached a young, ambitious artist named Bob Kane and asked him to come up with a character that could potentially match the success of Superman. He brought in Bill Finger and he pitched the concept of a Batman to him. He came up with a design, said he wanted Batman to wear red tights. Bill Finger turned around and he came up with the idea of Batman wearing a cowl.
thank God.
He came up with the notion of the cloak. And upon his conception of these ideas, Bill Finger and Bob Kane came together to create this gothic figure. When Batman first came out, nobody knew that he was Bruce Wayne. He was just this enigmatic figure prowling through the streets of Gotham.
In his tights.
In his tights, acting as a vigilante and shooting people. Because at that point, he hadn't come up with his code yet.
Yeah, he had a gun, which anyone who follows Batman lore, probably from late 60s on, especially with Adam West, Batman taboo, never carried a gun. It was his code of honor, but like you said, he didn't have that code. And where did the code come from?
Bill Finger came up with that. Batman's design was partially inspired by another pulp figure that was popular during that era, called the Shadow. And in order to differentiate between the two, Bill Finger proposed the idea of making Batman object to guns. That's where the creation of Bruce Wayne came from. That was his origin. Bill Finger ended up helping to revitalize the comic book industry in a period of time where comic book figures, superheroes, were coming and going.
Yes.
With the exception of Superman, they had very few real top-tier heroes.
Yeah, I always liking it too. I mean, we're in Massachusetts, by the way, beautiful Newburyport. A little bit of a far cry from Foxborough, which is closer to where I come from. I always liken the whole Bill Finger and Bob Kane thing. To me, Bob Kane is like Bob Kraft. He takes all the credit for all the genius that goes on and all the success with the Patriots. And Bill Finger is like Belichick. He's the fall guy. He doesn't get as much of a mention, and like you said, he came up with all of the great aspects of Batman. The idea of no gun, when even Captain America, with Timely Comics back then, was carrying a gun. He was at war.
He was shooting Nazis left and
shooting
right.
Nazis, and it was okay to shoot Nazis kids back then. But that's the thing. When he came up with that idea of Batman not carrying a gun, it was absolutely genius because not only was it a very convenient way for the comics code that came later, but it epitomized this moral superiority that Batman had over other heroes other than Superman, who didn't need a gun because bullets bounce off his chest. So he didn't need a gun and he could fry your gun with his eyes. I mean, cook an egg or stop you in a bank robbery. He could do it all. But Batman really was, to me, all-time great hero. And, you know, not just the virtuous part, but it's Batman. Operates outside the law sometimes, does what needs to be done, but not quite to the extent of, like, the Punisher and other characters.
Oh, not even close.
No.
Yeah, he's a far cry from that type of figure. The Punisher's a good example of a completely unfettered Batman. Somebody who prowls through the streets and just metes out justice however he sees fit.
Exactly.
With Batman, that was pivotal to his character. Having that code, that chief maxim, that's what helped him stand out from a lot of the other gothic figures that were prevalent in the comic book industry at the time. Because you have the Phantom as well.
Right.
He was another one of those pulp figures.
Yes, Phantom was pretty cool.
Yeah, Phantom was pretty cool.
But yeah, I mean, DC Comics hit a absolute home run with Batman. They were very smart to do that.
Yeah.
It's because Batman strikes a chord with everybody, where Superman was the Uberman, the epitome of everything you could be. Batman was basically, yes, he was a rich kid, but if you work hard for it, if you bring yourself to peak mentality, if you get scholarly enough, if you put yourself in the right direction, you could be Batman. If you had the capital, and that's what I liked about, you know, we'll discuss so many different Batman runs, but that's kind of what I liked about Chris Nolan's universe of Batman. It really hammered home the point that if you had these funds and you wanted it bad enough, you could be Batman in a practical manner.
If you had the capital and you had the code.
Exactly.
Anybody could be Batman. One of the overarching themes in the Dark Knight trilogy is that anybody can be a hero. That's prevalent throughout The Dark Knight Rises with John Blake, where essentially we're seeing his origin. Mm-hmm. But I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think that's helped him modernize the character as well.
Yeah, because when I think of top-tier comics, you think Marvel and DC. You don't want to think Burger King, McDonald's, and be that black and white, but it is. They are the two top. And when I think of the top two heroes out of both, it's unequivocally, for me, Batman, Spider-Man. Because while they come from different backgrounds, they have the key component of that everyman mentality. Batman is in a league of gods. DC pantheon of superheroes all come from God and Norse god and Greek god lore. And Batman is kind of like the human spectator in the middle with a lot of money. And with Marvel, you have Peter Parker as the everyday kid from Queens who gets bit, who has, I would say, even more of a superiority code than Batman. Like, Peter Parker, you will never, in good stories, see him break that moral code ever. Where Batman, from time to time, will be tested. Like, you know, we'll go into it later, but there have been storylines in Batman history that he's pushed his moral code to the point where you're just like, as the reader, oh, snap the Joker's neck. I mean, you're going to save millions of lives if you do it because the guy's going to keep killing. But Batman always brings himself back to that. And I think of it like this. Batman makes the hard calls that I don't think I could as a superhero. It would be really hard to watch these people break out of Arkham over and over and over again. I don't know if I could stick to that. I can't kill you. What do you think?
No, well, we see Batman grapple with that decision
in
some of the great runs that have been written throughout the character's history. He even ends up grappling with many of his own allies on account of it.
Yep.
People who want him to do things a different way. Mm-hmm. And for him, like you said, I think in some of the best story arcs, he's pushed to that limit. But the best writers, they know how far to push. They're able to do so gracefully. There's a point to what they're doing.
Agreed.
But they know never to push too far. Because Batman himself, he wouldn't go that far. There's a quality to him. We talk about him being an everyman. Even though his moralistic code can sometimes seem murky.
Yep.
There are certain things that Batman will absolutely not do. And I think that's part of what elevates him above a lot of the other superheroes, whether it's a DC Comics or
Any
Marvel
comics,
or any other imprint.
You know, he became a blueprint for so many other superheroes, and then long down the line we had the dark and gritty 90s who just kind of took what Batman stood for and just bastardized it in a way that you're lucky you have a Batman around because it was so bad.
That was a dark era.
But, I don't want to give people the impression who aren't familiar with Batman lore that Batman was this guy with a gun, and he just wasn't. The thing that Bill Finger did was he knew that in order, like, what would be the motivation for somebody to do this in real life? Because comics were fantastic back then. They were all very outlandish ideas, and they only got even more outlandish when Stan Lee came on the scene with Marvel Comics. Bill Finger basically grounded Batman and said, well, what would drive a person to want to throw on a cape and collar when he's rich? Because DC didn't have an origin for Batman at first. They just had him going around. He was this very noirish figure who, like you said, metes out justice and then would disappear into the shadows. And then as he became so popular, they said, well, let's give him a background. Let's give him an alter ego. And when Bill Finger came up with the idea of Bruce Wayne, it was funny because it gave Batman the money to do what Batman does, because he had planes, trains, automobiles, bat jets, bat boats, bat telescope, bat
shark repellent.
Yeah, every bat shark repellent. Everyone should have bat shark repellent.
I've got bat shark repellent.
But they nailed it down to, well, something tragic had to happen to this man to drive him. And they did a fantastic job when they came up with the conception of Thomas and Martha Wayne, who don't really have a backstory. They're like just these holy figures in comics that all their exact purpose was to exist, to die, to give us Batman. And it worked out so well. And Bill Finger was so above his time when he decided that, you know what? Batman has to differentiate himself for reasons with the Shadow and the Phantom. And he said, well, why wouldn't he carry a gun? Light bulb. Let's have his parents killed by a gun in front of him when he's a child. And the traumatic shock made Batman hate guns. And it was brilliant. It's still brilliant to this day. I mean, fantastic idea.
That was the thing about the comic book industry back then. You had all these writers and artists coming up with these characters. A lot of these guys were not professional artists and writers, particularly the writers. Mm-hmm. Many of the stories are grammatically inept. They're not articulate.
Word balloons.
Exactly. Thought bubbles.
Oh, awful.
But what they had was imagination.
Much.
It was that creative enthusiasm that brought these characters into being. And we saw plenty of that with Batman. So as the decade rolled on, we saw Bruce Wayne develop into an actual character. Mm-hmm. They built upon his origin story. They started introducing villains for him to go up against.
Oh, yeah.
They started creating this entire world. So even though they had a series of one-off stories with no attention to continuity, they built up this city, Gotham, and they created all these figures, eventually culminating in the creation of characters like Joker.
The best of all time.
And then later, Robin, a companion, somebody that he could trudge through this darkness with.
Yes.
And so they introduced Dick Grayson. They gave him his own tragic backstory.
Right.
Justification for these two characters coming together, aligning. And it was in the early 50s that things changed significantly.
Oh, yeah. There was a book published. An author took it to Congress. It was called Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wortham. And he basically came up with the concept that comic books, which were much lighter back then, much, much lighter, were poisoning kids' minds, much like television would later, people would so declaim. And he went to Congress and said, listen, I want to ban comic books. They have no educational, no type of value whatsoever. And Congress wasn't going to do that. They were on board with some of his ideas, but he was so staunch, he wanted the abolishment of comic books. So what Congress ended up passing was a comics code. And basically it was, I'll lighten it up a bit, but George Carlin would refer to it as something different, but we'll just call it the wussification of comic books. Because what they did was they passed this code. You would see a stamp on your comic book and it would say CA. And it would be this little, it looked like a postage stamp. It would be the Comics Code Authority. And, well, if you read that book, you knew you were going to get basically like a Looney Tunes fluff piece, because they couldn't push stuff like Bill Finger's great ideas. because Batman was just hitting its stride and bringing out all the villains. You had the Joker, most memorable, the Penguin, Catwoman, the Riddler, and I want to say those were the first three. But what people don't realize was Batman's first villains were gangsters,
Yep.
were just regular everyday crime, and mad scientists, Hugo Strange, who they brought back into Batman lore in the late 70s and whatnot. But he was fighting like Monster Men and Frankenstein and stuff like that because, like you said, I don't think when they created Batman, they had this brilliant idea, but they had no direction for him whatsoever.
None whatsoever. They adhere to all the typical genre tropes.
Exactly.
Like you said, he fought monsters. He fought Martians.
Yes.
He fought Nazis.
Yep.
All these typical figures that were so commonplace in comics back then,
Exactly.
they incorporated them into Batman. It wasn't until we got figures like Joker, like Catwoman, that he had somebody more memorable to go up against.
Exactly.
And in the early 50s, when they implemented the comic code, really the mid-50s, around 1954.
Yeah, it was, I think, 54.
They introduced more characters to offset what they considered to be homoerotic themes in Batman. Because Robin was much younger than Batman.
Right. Much younger.
I mean, Robin was 10, 11 years old.
Yeah, I think in his inception, Dick Grayson was probably like 11 at best.
Yeah.
And that would beg the question of why a billionaire would spend all his time hanging out with an 11-year-old boy. Now, if it was his like son or his brother, it would have been accepted. But this was just a kid who went through tragedy himself that he plucked off the streets and said, I'm going to throw him in short shorts and have him run off rooftops with me. And yeah, so I think, like you said, they started introducing more characters. But it went from Batman to like Batman and Family because it just stretched everywhere.
And they built upon it so quickly to offset what were these perceived homoerotic overtones, which really did not exist.
No, not in comics.
That was an
then.
overreaction.
Absolutely.
They ended up introducing the original Batwoman, Kate Kane, because they wanted to give Batman a love interest.
Yep.
And then, soon after, we were introduced to Batgirl.
Yeah.
And then we got Batdog. It got to the point where it became increasingly outlandish. It became campier, and it sort of laid the foundation for the show that would emerge in the late 60s.
Yeah. We got those, but we didn't get Barbara Gordon until the show existed.
That's right. So
we got Kathy Kane, and then what happened was Yvonne Craig, she did such a fantastic job in bringing the bookworm, crime-fighting character of Barbara Gordon to life that people said, we want this in the comic book now. And they introduced her, and I want to say it was in Detective Comics in the mid-350s. The number escapes me. It might be 357. You can stump me on that if you want. Leave it in the comment section. But Robin and Batgirl actually became Batman's sidekicks. They almost took over, and then they also decided we still need more. So they decided to do The World's Finest, which was Batman and Superman, the two big guns that they had.
That's right. Mid-50s, we ended up getting that. Because of the implementation of the comic code, and just because people were interested in other subjects, the comic book industry went through a lull. So, as a means of drawing interest back to the characters, they ended up teaming both Batman and Superman up.
Yep. Always. For about, 5 years? Almost every issue was Batman and Superman versus Nazis, Batman and Superman versus aliens, Batman and Superman versus, sea monsters, Batman and Superman versus childbirth. I mean, it was everything you could think of. And then how many times did they say, oh, we've got Batman, and we've got Superman, we've got Joker, and we've got Lex Luthor. It became WWE-esque that every single issue was Batman and Superman versus Joker and Lex Luthor. But if they really wanted to shake it up, it was Superman and Batman versus Lex Luthor and Joker. You know what I mean? They tried to switch you on. And that, I think, really hurt them because people were just like, I'm reading the same thing. And comics were way more often back then. They were coming out very fast. So I think it was like every 2 to 3 weeks at the most you'd get a comic book. Or if you didn't get a comic book, you got the other title. So you had the combination of it constantly.
And like you said, they were constantly recycling plot elements.
Right.
So eventually people became fatigued.
Big time.
They started to hemorrhage readers. There weren't as many people flocking to superhero comics anymore. And then came the 60s, the emergence of Marvel Comics. That shook things up when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee came up with all these awesome characters, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man. And this was sort of a dark period for Batman comics.
Yeah, I would say Batman was a very far second in... DC Comics in general was probably a very far second when Marvel emerged.
I agree, because once Marvel emerged, it shook the foundation of the comic book industry. It made superheroes cool again.
Yes.
People were so accustomed to seeing all the same stories recycled in Superman, Batman. So even those people who continued reading the comics, I don't think many of them were as impassioned as they once were when Bill Finger and Bob Kane were actively working on the title.
Yeah. Basically, Marvel does what any good competition did. It made DC step their game up. I think if you want to put it down to it, Marvel Comics was listening to people out in the world, and DC was pandering and being very patronizing to people. Like, basically, it was Hulk Hogan telling you, eat your vitamins, say your prayers, drink your milk. And Marvel was kind of like, hey, you know what? Let's work with the window outside your door. You know, let's look with the world. Sorry, a little excited. The world outside your window. Let's look at that and say, you know, let's take all these and just throw a fantastic element on top of it. When DC was like, oh, here comes an alien from out of the sky. And then they really went bad when they had like the imaginary tales, where it would be like Batman and Son, but you know, it would be Batman Jr. and Superman Jr. Then you even got like Lois Lane Jr.
All
and
these
it was
what-if
just
scenarios.
Really bad.
You could tell that they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. They didn't know what to do with any of the characters. There was no inspiration there. Right. They were coasting. And you look at Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I look at them as a sort of Bill Finger and Bob Kane figures. Stan Lee was Bob Kane.
Yes.
And Jack Kirby was definitely Bill Finger, because he had all these creative, outrageous ideas.
His artwork is beyond everything that was published at DC at that time.
Oh, fantastic. It helped elevate Marvel above DC.
Oh, yeah.
So in the late 60s, Batman had a resurgence of sorts with the Batman TV series.
And I know that you are not the biggest fan of that, but that was my introduction to Batman. Now, no, I was not born in the 60s, but my father, he loved it so much that some of my first memories are me in a crib with the na 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 na. I mean, always. Actually, a funny point. I liked that theme song so much that I used to make my mom sing that to me to go to sleep at night. You know, she would sing me a couple poems, but I'd be like, Mom, do the Batman song. And she'd be like, na 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 na, and I'd go to sleep. But what the Batman show did was, yes, it was campy, but it knew it was campy. And it was just so much style that you couldn't help but fall in love with it. It gave you, first of all, the Batmobile in the show is one of my all-time favorites. The Batmobile from Adam West's era, amazing. Because the Batmobiles in the comic books at that time were really ugly.
Yeah,
they were hideous. You know, it gave you a cool Batcave. It gave you the villains. That's where Batman shines. Your hero is only as good as his villains, and Batman has the best villains of any comic still today.
Oh yeah, fantastic rogue gallery. Now, like you said, the show also gave us Barbara Gordon, Batgirl.
Yeah.
I have an appreciation for the show. I can look at it and celebrate it for what it is.
Yes.
And it helped lead to a resurgence in Batman's popularity, temporarily.
Right.
It also did some damage to the character as well. The Batman series was, if you go back and watch it now, it's a lot of fun. Everybody knows.
I watch it all the time.
They know how campy it is. They're all selling their roles in that manner. You know, we had the Riddler constantly posing riddlers. It was so fun to listen to consider what he was saying.
Oh my God.
Especially as the series progressed and it became more and more ridiculous.
Frank Gorshin is the best interpretation of the Riddler ever. I mean, here's a guy in lime green tights with question marks all over it, and it looked like spray painted green loafers. I think that's exactly what it was. He just drew you in so well. Like, the riddles were stupid. They were mostly grade school riddles, But he was so fantastic in that role. And then I would have to also give a big kudos to my favorite Catwoman of all time, Julie Newmar. And, you know, without a doubt, she was sexy, she was very flashy, and she threw herself into the performance. And brilliant thing about Julie Newmar was she went, like most of the actors on that show, she went over the top with her interpretation of Catwoman, with the whole meow and like the saucers of milk and like all the cat related paraphernalia. And what was cool was they brought like the Egyptian theme in with her, sort of, and then later with King Tut. It was just so visual, it was hard to dislike.
Well, that's the thing about the show. It had a flair to it. It was very stylistic. And that's where I think the show excelled. That and its dopey humor. Because the humor was so dopey that it was charming. You liked the characters. You enjoyed them.
Wholly everything. It was... Robin was... You know, Batman was from those times and all his villains, but Robin was plucked like out of the 1930s newsreels, like, gee whiz, Batman, you're so wonderful, like all that.
Robin became Jimmy Olsen.
Exactly, he just suddenly became Jimmy Olsen without the bow tie.
Yeah.
But it was such a great show. I mean, you balked at King Tut. I loved King Tut because he was such a ridiculous character, but they still did well with him. You know what I mean?
Well, within the context of the show, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'd balk at him per se. For me, I'd more just laugh at it because it reminds me of just how ridiculous it was. Right. And that's why you celebrate the show. I mean, the show just recently came out on Blu-ray. They released the complete series. I picked up the movie a couple of months ago.
Love it.
It's a sort of thing where you can sit back, you turn your brain off.
Oh, yeah.
And you can just indulge. It's fun to watch.
Another good question. Some days you just can't where do you get rid of a bomb? You know what I mean? It's just, that movie was hard to dislike. It was so... That was the bat shark repellent. That was just,
the
unbelievably
gigantic
great.
bomb. How can you hate something like that?
Right.
It's not like Batman and Robin, where it effectively neutered the franchise.
No, not at all.
Where it seemed to sully everything that was good about the character.
Right.
I just think it was a fun show to watch.
It was a great show. It's one of my fondest memories. As a matter of fact, my girlfriend and I, it's one of her favorite interpretations of Batman. She loves the flashiness and the, just the dopey humor, and it brings you back. It revitalizes your childhood in a lot of aspects. Even if you didn't grow up in the 60s, I would venture to say a lot of people who were introduced to Batman were introduced to that because it ran for so long in reruns. And yes, Miss B, I put you on the spot there, but you do love that show just as much as I do. And then she's a woman after my own heart. As a matter of fact, she loves the Michael Keaton version of Batman, which is one of my favorite interpretations, and we'll get into that later. But the thing to wrap up with the 60s, it just did a lot for Batman. What I think it did was it drew national attention to Batman, and it put him back in the spotlight. But you said it was a double-edged sword. What it also did was the people who didn't like the show were expecting to read the exact same Batman in the comic books. And DC started knowing that because it was turning people off when the 70s came around. You no longer had the campy show on the air. It wasn't new every week. The way it was written was serialized television, whereas in Tune In Next Week and everything was two-parters. So you had to tune in, will Batman and Robin survive? Find out. It was very comic book-like, where it was like, join us again in 30 days for next adventure of... And so it did a lot. And it also gave some throwaway characters new life. Like, Maxie Zeus is just a revamp of King Tut in a better form. And I personally think the best interpretation of Maxie Zeus was the animated series, but we'll get to that later as well, too. We said in the intro that we would ask 3 questions. So we're not going to just rhetorically ask them and not answer them. The first question was, why does Batman pick Robin so young? And the very easy answer is, Bruce Wayne went through such a tragedy at such a young age. He lost his childhood right then and there. He was Batman from 8 years old on. He was just lost in darkness. Even though he had Alfred, he had millions of dollars, later billions. He just had no direction, no rudder. He just was lost. He was always looking for mom and dad. So when Dick Grayson loses his parents in the circus in the very same circumstances by a mugger's bullet, he empathizes and he identifies with that and says, that was me. And I don't want Dick going through that. So he plucks him out of obscurity and brings him in as his ward, which I guess is a fancy way of saying, I'm going to adopt you, but it sounds cooler.
Yeah, essentially.
And I think a lot of writers and a lot of people, casual fans, if you don't really read into the Batman mythos, they miss the point of Robin, like you were saying. It was somebody to take Batman out of the darkness while he's helping somebody forge their way through it for the first time. They both exist because they're needed.
If Bruce didn't have these partners, these family members to help humanize him, to provide him with this emotional spark, he could very easily lose his way, get lost in his war against crime.
Exactly.
But figures like Dick Grayson, especially considering Grayson has a completely different personality, he's more upbeat.
Right.
He's humorous.
Fantastic.
He's charismatic. And he does a good job of grounding Bruce.
Right.
I think that's what he does. And I think that's what all the Robins have done to some extent. Even Jason Todd.
Yes.
Because I think Jason Todd made him look at what he was doing and re-examine how he wanted to approach it.
Absolutely.
And of course, he retreated inwards for a period of time until Tim Drake, the eventual third Robin, came along.
Tim Drake, I mean, while we're jumping a little bit ahead to the 90s, Tim Drake, to me, was very unique because he was the only Robin that basically did the smart thing and said, I know you're Bruce Wayne. I know you're Dick Grayson. I'm not a stupid kid. You need to get back together because Batman and Robin were at odds with each other. Dick Grayson, Nightwing, was trying to forge his own way. And Bruce Wayne was at the point where he didn't think he needed a sidekick anymore, but he was getting darker and darker. And Tim Drake was like, no, you guys are like peanut butter and jelly. You need each other. This is what it is. And what was the catalyst for that, we'll go into in the late 80s, was the death of Jason Todd.
Yep.
But I think we should jump ahead right now. The 60s, for what it was phenomenal as far as the Batman TV shows.
Yeah.
The comic books was absolute dreck. They're unreadable in my view.
They're putrid.
They're
putrid. You talked about how Marvel was innovating in the 60s. They were listening to what people wanted.
Yes.
Or what they were interested in. They were going beyond that as well. They were offering people things they didn't know they wanted.
Exactly.
Whereas DC was pandering. And in Batman's comics, that's all they did was pander. They knew that the show was successful, so they took that campy quality and they distilled the essence of Batman into that, and it wasn't as successful. You didn't have the actors. You didn't have the charisma of it.
You couldn't get that to leap off the page the way it leapt off the screen, and it suffered for it greatly to the point where Batman sales were really, really down. Superman sales were always in the middle as they were. They were just very run-of-the-mill. Superman had its following, and I love Superman. I'm a fanboy of pretty much all comic books. But my true love for comic books is Batman first and foremost. Like I said, when the show went off the air, it got really bad towards the end of it. When they introduced a character called Lord Fogg,
God.
It was horrible. It was Lord Fogg and his wife. And it took a 3-parter in England with Batgirl and Batman and Robin. It just, that was when the show jumped the shark. It was so bad. They knew it was time to call it quits, but the unique thing was everyone wanted to be part of Batman. You had all these marquee actors, Cesar Romero, Frank Gorshin. A lot of them were like Broadway actors, serious actors, go out there and throw themselves into these roles. So it revitalized attention to Batman, but it didn't explain or set in stone what Batman was. It wasn't the right characterization.
No, it didn't really rekindle the true spirit of Batman. Like you said, it drew national interest to him for the first time in probably about a decade.
Right.
But it really did nothing to contribute to his lore.
No, it didn't. It's a fun piece in time when you take it for what it is. You look at it and say, I'll turn my brain off and sit down and watch it, and I'm just going to enjoy it because it's a fun show. But I don't think DC wised up until the 70s when they brought on one of my all-time favorite teams, Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams. Neil Adams has created some of the most iconic Batman imagery of all time. He gave you the best versions of the Joker and Batman, the flowing cape, and just amazing stuff. And it got darker because I think it was trying to distance itself so much from the TV show. They were saying, well, no, we want more readers back. We're going to give you a Batman that's a little bit different. But in order to do that, it did take from the show one thing. They realized, well, we cannot go back to the era of muggers and mad scientists, so we need these colorful antagonists for Batman.
This rogue gallery.
The rogue gallery became very, very important in the 70s. It did a lot of changes to Batman. I think, without in a way, it made Bruce younger somehow. He seemed to get a little bit younger. He moved out of the Batcave and into a penthouse.
He also got much bulkier.
He did. He built up, you know what I mean? And he just got a little bit more of a socialite aspect to him. He was way more of a ladies' man in the 70s than he ever was in the comic books. And it was cool, but what it did was it showed you that rather than going back to that time period, because they could have very easily just said, okay, well, now back to our regularly scheduled program of Batman and Robin, and having Batman and Robin pick up from where they were in the 60s. It didn't do that. It made Dick Grayson older. Somehow it made Bruce Wayne younger and Dick Grayson older, because Dick Grayson went to college. He became his own man and wanted to forge, like any good son would, forge away from his father and create his own path. Yeah. And it brought a real sense of realism to the comic books.
Yeah, he forged his own identity. And what was nice to see is that he aged. There was true continuity here. Right. There was a passage of time. Absolutely. And for a long period of time, they didn't recognize that at all.
No.
There were a lot of these one-off or two-part stories.
Exactly.
And I think Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams' run, when they ended up working on Batman together, they restored Batman to his darker roots.
Yes.
But what's nice is they also injected some much-needed personality into the figure.
Yeah.
We had all these characters. So they look at a guy like Joker. Up to that point, Joker had become a joke.
He was.
I mean, he was
very apropos.
He was a cheeky villain. There was nothing intimidating about him.
No.
He was just a thorn in their side. Somebody to meddle in their affairs. He liked to prod at them.
Right.
But there was nothing really imposing about him.
No.
Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams ended up reconstructing the villain.
Yep.
The Joker that we see today has his roots in Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams' run. He also ended up revamping villains like Two-Face, who had essentially disappeared from the comics. Yeah. They weren't doing anything with him. And they turned him into the iconic villain that we know today as well. And to answer our second question, Ra's al Ghul, they introduced Talia and Ra's al Ghul.
Yes,
now, the proper pronunciation for it is Ra's al Ghul, but the popular pronunciation is Ra's al Ghul. Yeah. You hear that in the Dark Knight trilogy.
Yes, yeah.
It's how I've always pronounced it.
I think it's easier for people to say. And my interpretation, when they brought Liam Neeson into the Dark Knight trilogy with Batman Begins, they tried to do that bait and switch with you and say that Ken Watanabe was going to be Ra's al Ghul, and he had the bald head with the goatee, but he looked like Fu Manchu, and I'm like, that's not Ra's al Ghul. And then you had Ducard, which was Liam Neeson, and he looked just like Ra's al Ghul in a suit, and I'm like, I'm waiting for the whole bait and switch the whole movie, and I got it at the end, and I was like, good, because that was the only way that they could have went with that. But when I think of, as great, I love Liam Neeson. Almost every movie he's in. Taken 1, 2, not so much 3. But when I think of Ra's al Ghul, my interpretation, and even the pronunciation, from the animated series with David Warner, his voice acting, unbelievable. Like when you hear that, well, detective, that voice, it booms. And it's got, a sense of menace to it. And it's just so good. I mean, almost all the voice actors on the Batman animated series nailed it. They were the 60s show reincarnated in cartoon form.
Oh, yeah, but in a much darker manner.
Yes, oh, absolutely. Way better.
It approached the subject material far more seriously than the TV show ever did.
Definitely.
What was nice about his interpretation as well is that he had this deep booming voice that conveyed this sense of menace and dread, but also intellect.
Right.
Because first and foremost, Ra's al Ghul, is one of his most formidable and intelligent foes. And we have Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams to thank for that.
We definitely do. And as we could say that Dick is a son to Bruce, a surrogate son, I would have to say that Ra's al Ghul could technically serve as a father figure to Bruce Wayne. He's got more resources than Bruce Wayne. He's more of a billionaire than Bruce Wayne. He's more of a world scale. And he's not quite evil. He basically, his agenda is he wants to restore the Earth to its natural existence. Before the technology, before the corruption, before the politics, before the hatred and the wars. He wants Earth in its purest form, almost in like a Gaia-like form. But he basically goes about it the wrong way. He just says, well, I am rich and I'm doing it, and that's it. But what is really cool with Ra's al Ghul, and he's one of my favorite villains too, is they took an aspect that is so off the wall. They took immortality and brought it into the Batman comic books.
The Lazarus Pit.
With the Lazarus Pit, and obviously where that's derived from. And they decided that this is the way it would work. It would make sense if he immerses himself. It's essentially the Fountain of Youth, where he would immerse himself in it and go. And I think he's estimated somewhere around 600 years old. And it's funny because even though they focus on his daughter Talia, who's a very big part of Batman lore, he does have more children and successors. He just kind of doesn't acknowledge them.
Well, the comics don't really acknowledge them.
They're not as engaging.
No.
They're like footnotes. They kind of just want to explain what he did for 500 years. You know what I mean?
Well, and we'll get into this in the 80s as well, because as interesting a villain as he is, the comics have not often taken advantage of the fact that he is a member of Batman's rogue gallery.
Yes.
We've had some throwaway stories here and there, but it wasn't really until Grant Morrison took over in the mid-2000s that he became a central villain. Both him and Talia.
Exactly. What Grant Morrison did was he took what Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams and Mike Barr did years before. They did this comic book called Son of the Demon, which basically, to me, this is one of the most defining Batman comics of all time. Where I mentioned before that Ra's al Ghul could be interpreted as a sort of surrogate and also, father figure to Bruce Wayne. The reason why is Ra's realizes that he can keep immersing himself in this Lazarus Pit, but he is going to grow old to the point eventually where he can no longer do it. Now, he sustained himself for over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It isn't until he comes across Bruce Wayne and decides, I need someone to carry this on. And he doesn't attack Batman right away. He basically figures out who he is, meets him in his cave, his own grounds. He takes that's the first person that I can remember in Batman comics to show up in the Batcave. The first villain to be like, I'm here, I'm at your door. And he just basically proposes to him. He goes, listen, I have this agenda, blah, 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 blah. I want you to be my successor. And Batman struggles with it at first because he doesn't know what his agenda really is. So he whisks him away to the Middle East and, wines and dines him and all that. And then when he realizes that it's basically annihilation of 75% of the planet's population to do this, and he wants Bruce and Talia to create a race of new people.
A super race.
A super race. And that's when Bruce rejects it and he becomes a lifelong enemy of Ra's al Ghul.
He's adamantly opposed to it because it doesn't adhere to his moral values.
Exactly.
Ra's al Ghul, one of the major components of the character, is that by constantly immersing himself in these Lazarus pits and resurrecting himself over time, he's gone a little bit nutty. He's become increasingly mad. A little bit Frank Miller, that's good.
He does. And each time he does it, it gets worse. And the effect is a little bit longer. But what's really unique is, even though Ra's, like Batman, has his own code, he could easily squash Batman at any time. He knows all his secrets. There's nothing from outing him. He doesn't do it because deep down, he respects the mission. And I think, truthfully, he loves the competition. Because I think he thinks the longer Batman fights this war with him, one of these days, Batman's going to succumb and say, you're right, let's do it your way.
He'll come over to his side.
Exactly.
He holds out.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's an intriguing villain because he's very regal. He's basically like a king or a pharaoh, the way Ra's presents himself.
And he has the appearance to reflect that.
Right.
These long, elegant robes, the outfits, how ornate they are.
I know. Just amazing imagery. And we have Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams to thank for that. And Ra's didn't really appear in the 80s at all.
No.
It was after their run he went to the wayside.
No, not until the late 80s with, the minor story.
Right.
Where Bruce and Talia come together for the first time. But before we move on to the 80s, I think the greatest contribution that Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams made to Batman lore was the Bat Chest.
Oh, Hairy Chest Love God Batman. So great. I mean, it was like Austin Powers every time he took off his shirt. You're like, dude, just shave that thing.
Oh, it's funny.
But it's hilarious.
He looked like he belonged on the cover of a romance novel.
He always did. And they made Bruce enjoy his money a bit more in the 70s because he had all this stuff. And yes, he was very dark, but he was like, I'm also a millionaire. I gotta go get some. And he's do it. You know what I mean?
He was a playboy who actually enjoyed being around women.
I thought that was an interesting aspect of him because you don't really see that very much. It's usually Bruce Wayne is the mask and he doesn't, I don't want to go sleep with this woman. I'd much rather be chasing the Riddler on a rooftop. But in the 70s, they opened it up like Silver St. Cloud.
Yep. There you go. There's another big contribution.
Who I think was a great
Silver St. Cloud went on to become one of his more known love interests. Right. But those were all their major contributions. They kind of laid the foundation for what was to come in the 80s, particularly the mid-80s, when a young pioneering writer and artist named Frank Miller came along and redefined the character again.
Yeah, he didn't just redefine him. He went so far with his version of Batman that for a while it became the Batman. But I will say this. We have our difference of opinion on Frank Miller. Dark Knight Returns is my all-time favorite Batman story because it gave you so many answers. It gave you Jim Gordon knew Bruce Wayne was Batman and they became friends.
Which is understandable.
Right.
I think we have these powerful moments too. Regardless of how dark the story was, how gritty it was.
Right.
It had this sort of gritty realism to it. It had so many iconic moments. Oh. Bruce coming to the understanding that he can't resist the lure of Batman any longer. He has to be him. And that sequence of panels, it's so great.
It really is.
And it culminates with him leaping through the sky as lightning crackles in the distance.
It's just amazing because you have Alfred who's still around while Bruce is in his 60s. And I don't even know. You'd have to put Alfred at, 90 in that?
Yeah. When we see that he's frail.
He's very, very frail. Story. But, yes, that iconic sequence, it's a full circle sequence, too. It's Bruce Wayne coming home and sitting in that chair that he did before. And the same damn bat crashing through the window again, 40 years later. That revitalizes him. And he goes from taking his Tom Selleck mustache off, going downstairs. But talk about bulking up. I mean, he became the Hulk. That was the only thing. The imagery of Batman in costume when Frank Miller draws him is parallel to none. But the image of Bruce Wayne is very jarring because he's huge.
He's blocky.
Very blocky.
Yeah, Frank Miller depicts him as a blocky figure.
Yeah.
And of course, he's older. He's in his 50s by this point. He points that out, too.
That's right.
He says he should be in agony, but he's not.
He's not.
Because he loves what he's doing.
Yeah.
And of course, we get these scenes. He goes after Two-Face.
Oh,
and
one of the best.
He looks at Two-Face and he sees himself in him. He feels empathy for him. There's compassion there because he sees how broken this man is. I also think that he nailed his depiction of the Joker. I like how when we first see Joker, he's in this catatonic state. Batman has been gone for about 10 years. The Joker hasn't had any purpose. And as soon as he sees that Batman is back, I love that scene. He bears this wide grin and he goes, "Darling."
Yeah.
It's great.
It's Frank Miller at his best writing it. But what he also did with the Joker in that series or that story, because it was a one-off, he gave you the menace of the Joker back again, but he gave it to you in the worst way possible. What was cool was the Joker had become this sympathetic figure. The bureaucrats and all the people were pissed that Batman came back, and they wanted to say, well, look what Batman did to the Joker. He held him down. He was such a good person. And the Joker played right into it, and then they brought him on a talk show. And they're interviewing him, and he had the psychiatrist get him declared sane and everything. Just brilliant storyline. And all of a sudden on the talk show, he's like, and I'm going to kill everyone in this room right now. And he breaks the mug and slits the throat of the talk show host, who's supposed to be like Conan O'Brien. And a funny thing, Conan O'Brien's actually the voice actor of him in the animated movie they did depicting this, which was really cool. And I'm telling you, it's the best DC animated movie they've done.
Yeah, I've yet to see it.
But it gave you the question of, what does Batman have to do? I think Dark Knight Returns was the very first time that Batman's moral code was pushed to its absolute peak. Because the Joker didn't just kill people this time around. He killed men, women, children in droves. What about the scene when he's going through the tunnel of love and he's just watching all the couples in the boats and he's just walking by, bang, bang, bang. And as Batman's chasing him injured with a blade in him, he's just watching this trail of blood and the Joker's gleefully jumping from boat to boat, shooting everybody.
Just massacring people.
Just killing and annihilating people. And I loved it so much because Batman finally gets the Joker. And the Joker knows, you're Batman. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And Batman does the one-time thing that he could only do. He decides to end it because he's so beyond his moral code. He takes his neck, cracks it, and leaves the Joker there in a bloody heap for death. But what does the Joker do?
Well, he paralyzes the Joker,
right,
so that Joker can't hurt anybody else. Right. And he's already gone beyond his moral code at this point. Joker finishes the job. Himself. He looks at him, he laughs, and he snaps his neck.
He snaps his own neck. What he did was he defiantly looks at Batman because he was satisfied he pushed him enough. But then he wants Batman to have that complete turmoil. And he finishes the job, like you said, and he just, under his own power, breaks his neck the rest of the way. Like out of The Exorcist.
And he leaves Batman's reputation in shambles.
Right, because he's a murderer. And that storyline did really great wonders because it gave us a successor to Commissioner Gordon in Ellen Yin. And she was just almost like a female Commissioner Gordon, but she was really well done. The two things that I hated about Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, the only thing I think he doesn't understand the character of how to write Superman. He has a complete misinterpretation of Superman because he makes Superman a presidential lapdog for a really bad depicted Ronald Reagan in that comic book. Like, that is not Ronald Reagan. That was awful.
Well, he was lampooning the entire culture of the 80s.
Right.
But I agree. I don't think Superman would be the type to become this nationalistic lapdog.
Right.
This de facto weapon for the U.S. government.
Exactly.
Because he's got him over there fighting the Soviets.
Right, with nuclear bombs.
During the Cold War.
Yeah. Frank Miller, I think, has very misguided political views. Now, I mean, maybe I might share some of the same party with Frank Miller. I don't consider him part of the party that I am part of because he takes it so far in that direction where it's just like oppression at that point, really bad. But he also didn't get the concept of the world's finest either. He turned it that Batman and Superman were almost like mortal enemies. And Bruce had this disdain for Clark because he was up in the sky and Bruce was on the ground. Bruce would never have disdain for Clark Kent. The good Batman-Superman stories show you that Superman is a light to Batman.
Yeah.
While everyone idolizes Batman, Batman's got a secret idol, and it's Superman.
Yeah, he's a beacon. He's a friend.
Right.
He's a friend first and foremost.
Right.
We end up getting that iconic battle between them,
awesome.
Which was well done. He did a good job of considering how Batman could potentially beat Superman.
Right.
I like how he brings Oliver Queen into it.
That was
get
good.
To see Green Arrow.
Yep.
And I think he writes Green Arrow well.
I thought he did a good job.
But I don't think Superman's the type of individual that would ever sear off his arm the way that he does.
I didn't think that was written well. And I also didn't like Batman needs a Robin, and I think Frank Miller put it in there much in the way like Sam Raimi put Venom in the third Spider-Man movie, just because maybe DC said, hey, you got to put Robin in there. and because Batman was so synonymous with Robin, but he put Robin in there in a way that was just really bad. I mean, he would never take Carrie Kelly, who's a kid at an arcade with no experience whatsoever, fighting the mutants. So I think he misses the boat completely on the Robin character and what Robin stands for and what Robin's purpose is with Batman. But what I did like was he gave us the Gang of the Mutants. And they were basically just a harken back from the Falcons and everything that Batman fought earlier in Frank Miller's Year One story, which was the reinterpretation of Batman. And Batman was fighting kids and fighting, misguided youth. And then his ideals were so strong that after he beat up the mutant leader, they went to Batman's side and became the Sons of Batman, which, you get Batman as Paul Revere riding through Gotham on a horse, which, okay, maybe it doesn't work perfectly, but it's so badass to see Batman riding as Paul Revere, and I loved it. So.
Well, you've also got him as a cultish figure as well,
right?
Because that's what they look to him as.
Right.
He supplanted the mutant leader.
Exactly.
He's become their new leader, and he ends up rallying them to him towards the end of the story.
Yeah.
But we talk about all of Frank Miller's contributions. Those were two of the biggest Batman stories to come from out of the 80s. And then we move ahead to the late 80s. We've got two more, one of which I think is a classic, the other of which not so much. We've got Death in the Family, the death of Jason Todd.
Yeah.
Jason Todd was the second Robin. Comic book readers were not particularly keen on him.
Yeah, keen's a good word.
DC ended up having a poll where they could vote whether or not to kill him off. And, well, they voted to kill him off.
Yeah, but not by much, surprisingly.
No, it was pretty close.
It was very, very close margin, but that was the first reality-esque version of comic books, like where reality shows have you call in all the time, American Idol and all those other shows. That was the first time DC put it in the audience's hand, because they did draft up both versions of the comic book. And there is artwork floating around when the iconic panel of Batman holding Jason Todd's dead body in his hands, which was chilling to watch. It's such a good panel. But then they have the other one where it's, oh, he's alive. And, that never made it because people wanted him dead. I think people wanted him dead because DC went out of their way to make you hate him so much.
Oh,
because
the way that they depicted him, the way he was written. He wasn't particularly sympathetic.
No.
He had no charisma. He was whiny. And you can't really fault the character for that, because the character is a fictional creation.
Right, exactly.
It's the writers who are working on him.
Right.
But you had that. I think the only part of the story that really works is his death at the end, because prior to that, it's a pretty conventional story.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous with the Joker.
Oh, getting diplomatic immunity, yeah.
Stupid.
And then they bring Superman into it again.
Yeah, it's for no reason.
Right. Anytime there's a big Batman event, it's like, let's bring Superman in, just for, I think artists like to draw Superman, and that's fine. I would too. But yeah, Jason Todd's whole run, but they did a different story. Originally he was just a clone of Dick Grayson with red hair. A circus kid who got killed. His parents got killed by Killer Croc.
The street urchin.
Just really, really bad. Then they brought him back into as a street urchin, so to say. He was homeless and whatnot. One cool thing, Jason Todd, I always like the early story, was he stole the tires off the Batmobile.
Yeah, he was jacking.
And Batman came over to him and goes, oh, son of a gun, this kid I want. He's got something. I mean, he took the tires off the Batmobile. Maybe Batman doesn't know how to change his own tires, so he was like, all right, I'm bringing him home. But he had a bad habit of adopting kids. And I'm like, he was kind of like the mother whose kid grows up and she's like, oh, I want that feeling back, and goes and has another baby. He's like, oh, well, Dick's out of the cave. Jason, he got black hair. Looks like, all right, come on in. Except Jason was probably putting things in bags and, selling them on eBay before eBay existed. So that was a good contribution, but that also gave Two-Face a big purpose too, because he was very central in it. They had that one comic book where they had the noose around Batman's neck, and Two-Face was going to kill him, and Robin saves him. So, he had redeeming things. But they went out of the way to make you hate him, so they had Jason Todd kill the diplomat's son who came into Gotham City. And it was always a ambiguous thing. Did he push him? Did he not push him? He pushed him. It's pretty clear. Yeah, so he pushed him and he died, and Bruce caught that, but I think Bruce still saw redemption in him. Was like, maybe this is my fault, is a little wayward, and I want to, still save him, but he couldn't save him. And then Jason Todd chases after his own mother, which the Joker used like bait, and one of the most brutal scenes in comic books ever. I mean,
Oh yeah, where he throttles him with the crowbar.
he didn't like just hit him a couple times. The Joker just waylays on him over and over and over. You get panel after panel after panel of just Jason Todd's face going this way and that way, and then they blow him up on top of it if he wasn't dead.
All of a sudden, of course, his body is an incinerator.
I know. I never got that.
But this comic, it's pretty ridiculous in its tone. It's rather conventional. You think you would have seen more in the 60s.
Right.
All of a sudden, it becomes brutally realistic.
Right.
And you have that iconic scene of Batman cradling Jason Todd's prone body, like you said
just
from before.
Incredible.
That was the major contribution to that story, because it also impacted how he perceived his allies, whether or not he wanted people fighting alongside him, if this was going to be the end result.
Jason Todd did one good thing. They had to make Dick Grayson grow up. They couldn't go into the Simpsons like mentality of perpetually young forever, and Bart's always in the 4th grade. They had to make Dick Grayson grow up. And New Teen Titans was becoming a very popular book. And Dick Grayson was Nightwing in, like the Saturday Night Fever disco-style collar Nightwing. Like, just such a cool costume. I don't care. Anyone can hate on it. I love disco collar Nightwing.
Typical 80s fashion.
But they had to bring him out of it. And basically, if you put it into, let's say I'm a wrestling fan, so Jason Todd was a transitional champion. He existed to give birth to Tim Drake.
Yeah.
He had to die so that Batman could go to his lowest. Because like you said, Batman questioned everything. He's like, my mission, do I want kids around me anymore? And then it became to the point where even the people who were still formidable, who were his best allies, like Alfred, Barbara, who was grown up at this point, Dick Grayson was on his own and wasn't in any danger. He shunned them. He just closed the door on family whatsoever. And what it also did with Jason Todd was he gave Batman his first real mistake. His failure. Bruce Wayne was unfallible up to that point, and he failed because he did not. I mean, he missed Jason Todd saving him by like a split second. He died.
It's kind of like the scene in The Dark Knight where he fails to save Rachel Dawes.
Yes, exactly.
And that's exactly the word I was going to use, infallible. Up to that point, Batman was always generally able to save people in time.
Right.
He didn't run into anything like that. The Joker was never that victorious.
Exactly.
Save for in The Dark Knight Returns, but that's not a canonical story.
Right.
But it had major repercussions for what would occur with the character in the future.
Yes.
But the other 80s story I want to touch upon is Alan Moore's The Killing Joke.
Oh my God.
Which again, one of the definitive Joker stories.
Yes.
And it is one that we could sit here and talk about by itself for an hour.
We could do a podcast on just that book alone.
But that was highly influential as well, because that's where Barbara Gordon ends up being paralyzed.
Yes.
Joker shoots her in the gut. And that ends up giving rise to the character of Oracle.
Yes.
Who I think was one of the best characters to emerge from the Batman comics. But we also ended up getting a viable origin story for the Joker.
Right.
We don't have to choose to believe in it, but it's a sensible origin story.
It's a great origin story because he's a comedian.
Yeah.
He's a down on his luck, failed out comedian with a wife who thinks he's a failure and he just can do no right. He happens to know some gangsters. He's not a bad guy. And what happens, what is brilliant about Alan Moore is he took the Joker and just basically said, this is what happens to you if anyone has just one bad day. That one bad day that defines you. Now, of course, a lot of people, that's not true. We all have bad days. But like, if you had a day like that, would that be your culmination? Because what he does is he says, I'm going to take your wife away from you. And his wife was at that time pregnant with his son. And they get killed. And they're gone. And he loses everything. And it's funny because he had to throw himself into the gang just to make a score so he could provide for his wife and kid. Who, when they end up dead, he's got the money, but he doesn't have what he needed it for. So he also gets double-crossed by these gangsters. And Batman doesn't shove him in the acid. It's an altercation that he's not ready for, and he falls into the acid and turns into the Joker.
Yeah, the chemical vat.
The chemical vat. Sorry, not acid. It would just dissolve your face, and he would be like, a skeleton. And it was so well done that the Batman 1989 movie, which is one of my favorites of all time, with Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson, used that origin. But they had him more of a macho gangster.
Yeah, and they also turned him into Joe Chill. He's the one that kills Batman.
Right.
That's stupid. Jack Nicholson gave a great performance, but I think the film was fundamentally flawed. Batman Returns greatly improved upon it, but
Amazing.
I understand what you're saying. We saw that origin carried over into that.
Right.
But yeah, the Killing Joke was an iconic Joker story. Also introduced us to the Red Hood gang.
Yes. And gave them actual, like, real clout in Gotham, that because I think the Falcones and everything, because after all that there was a power vacuum, and here's this gang of street thugs who have a lot of abilities, but they didn't have Joker's inside ability. They needed his smarts, and even though he was a comedian, they needed his intellect, and they brought them all together. But you want to talk gruesome, I mean, Frank Miller might have pushed some envelopes, but I think Alan Moore really pushed the envelope, because even the imagery, I mean, it was a mature audience's comic book for before mature audiences comic books.
Oh, yeah, and it was becoming increasingly so as the 80s went along.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have Brian Boland to thank for that, too.
Yeah.
His great imagery, his crisp line work.
The shooting of Barbara, basically the Joker became a menace again, because he took the fight to not Batman's door this time, but Batman's ally in Commissioner Gordon. And it's still ambiguous to whether the Joker knew Barbara was Batgirl. I'd like to think he did, and he's smart enough to do it. I
suspect he did.
Because he attacked when Gordon wasn't there. And Barbara answers the door, and the Joker's just in a Tommy Bahama shirt with big sunglasses and a hat, just looking like a goof.
Oh,
and
he's so nonchalant. You see that gleam in his eye.
Right. And he just pulls out the pistol, and Barbara's like, "Can I help?" Bang. And right after that, you just look at that picture, and he severed her spine. And then for the Joker, that wasn't good enough. He had to push it just a little bit further. So he stripped Barbara of all her clothes. And depending on whose interpretation and what writer picks this up, you've got writers that show that the Joker just took compromising Polaroids. Remember those back before cell phones. And I still think Polaroids took some of the best pictures ever. You just got to, and they were fun. But he left them so that Gordon would be broken into madness. And then you have other writers who say that he straight out had his way with her physically. And that's a scary thing to do. But what it did was, like you said, it gave birth to, I think, the best handy-capable character in all of comic book lore. Oracle is Barbara Gordon. Because her contributions as Batgirl were never really more than just Robin Light. If Robin wasn't there, she was there. When she became Oracle, she became the central information cell and unit for all of Gotham City and Batman's activities. She was the computer whiz, and it wasn't like they shoehorned it, because she always was studying computers at Gotham City University, and also working with the police department because she was her father's daughter. So I thought that was really great.
Well, her working out of the clock tower, too. There's just so much that they ended up contributing to her. Her character became so much more interesting.
Absolutely.
So even though it was initially used as a plot device of sorts, other creators came along, and they were able to build off of what was a cataclysmic event.
Right. It was just such a stark contrast to what was done in Batman before, but it really was just one of those the OMG jaw-dropping things if you ever read it for the first time, especially if you read it when it came out.
Oh, yeah.
There was nothing like it out on those tables.
No.
And I thought it was brilliant, and that's when I read it too. And I still have my copy. It's in pristine condition. I mean, I love that book. But it also gave you the real depth of Batman and Joker's relationship. Like you said, Frank Miller got it too. The Joker exists with Batman. They're coin flips of each other.
Yeah, they exist in tandem.
And it's called The Killing Joke, and how apropos it is that the book ends on a joke. And it's the first time I think I've ever seen Batman laugh. And he hates the Joker so much. And you would think that Barbara getting violated and shot, Jim Gordon is the guy who reins Batman in that story, because Batman wants to kill the Joker. He wants him dead. And Gordon's like, you can't let him win.
No, you have to show him that our way works.
Right, and that's so iconic, because that's your daughter. Now, I don't know many people, if that was your daughter, that you could do it, but that's what makes Jim Gordon so virtuous. And I think that's what made Scott Snyder, and we'll talk about that later, that choose Jim Gordon as Batman's successor because he realizes, well, hey, we need somebody even more virtuous than Bruce Wayne, who's somebody whose hands aren't dirty at all. And that's why Jim Gordon's the new Batman, which I love it. I have nothing bad to say about the series. But we both underestimated how much Batman lore is. And there's just wasn't enough time to put it all into the constraints of this podcast. And we want to do it justice without glossing over any of the major contributions. So we decided that we're going to extend this to a second edition of the podcast. As a thank you to people for listening, we have a soundbite at the end of this that is Frank Gorshin as the Riddler asking you, the audience, or asking Batman and Robin at that time, a riddle. And the first person to send us an email with the correct answer to our email for our show, which is beyond the fourth with the number 4 at gmail.com, will get a new mint in box NECA 1989 Batman video game figure. I own this thing, and it is cool. It's all purple and blues like the old school video game. It's the paint scheme. And NECA has done just such a great job of taking all these popular images and characters from the 80s and revitalizing them in action figure form. We had such a blast doing this first time. We hope that you enjoyed watching it and listening as well. We'd like to do this for a long time. We are open to any type of subject matter or things as long as it's comic book or entertainment related.
Anything related to the industry. You
Right.
want us to talk about comic book movies, we're perfectly fine
Sure.
with that. We're well versed in it. And we don't just stick to DC and Marvel. If you want to hear us talk about Dark Horse comics,
Image.
Archie comics, Image comics especially.
I'll let you defer with the Archie comics. I'm not a Jughead guy.
That was some good Archie right
I
now.
know, I heard. With that being said, we just want to close out and thank everyone for watching.
Yep, let us know what you thought about our first show in the comments section below. Like and subscribe.
And we are going to answer the third question. Where does he get all those wonderful toys? Amazon, because everything comes from Amazon.
Of course, occasionally eBay too.
But we want to just thank you once again. We had a blast. It was a good time. And remember to leave the light on in the cave.
Thank you, guys.
Oh, what is it that no man wants to have, yet no man wants to lose?